Hello and welcome to Unleashed, the show that explores how to thrive as an independent professional. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and I'm excited to be here today with Braden Weinstock. Braden, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Will. Appreciate you having me.
So, Braden, I'd like to talk about your human operating system manifesto, which I find on your website, and I think is a bit distinctive. I don't know other people who have written an operating system. You've got your manifesto, operating values, and operating practices, and we'll talk through this. Tell me a little bit about kind of overall what gave you the idea for this, and how did this come about?
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for pointing this out. This is something that I've put a lot of work into over the years, and it really came about because over time I noticed when I started my career as a consultant, but also the last couple of years was working on building a fast-growing startup that turned into a unicorn. And what I noticed is we didn't really always have a way to figure out how to work together. We would meet people to jump onto a project, or we were onboarding people very quickly. And I started to think about what's important to me, what's important to who I am as a person and how I operate. And so started writing things down that were important to me and trying to describe them and share them with people who are either working with or for me. And you might have heard of the user manual. That started to be a popular version of it, but I didn't think it fully captured the depth of importance that I was trying to get at, which is like, what's behind my decision making and how, from a tactical perspective, do I operate? And so after putting this together and working on it, and people telling me, hey, this is actually really helpful for getting to know you and being able to develop a working relationship as a manager or as a colleague, as an executive. When I started building out my website, I thought, well, if I really want to live my values, I should own my values. And to own my values, let me be transparent with them and put them out there. And at the least, they'll attract people who find them interesting and align with them. They'll obviously maybe repel some people who don't align with them, and that's okay. And ultimately, I can live higher integrity and better alignment with who I am and the people I work with.
So let's talk through your operating values. So I'll just read off this list, if that's okay. So there's compassion and thoughtfulness, and then there's a plus button to expand on that. There's curiosity and humility, grit and discipline, logic and reflection, integrity and transparency, and then responsibility and accountability. What was the process that you went through to come down to this set of 12 values?
Yeah, it's definitely a process of constant iteration over the years. It started as like a long list. I did this values exercise where I started writing down what are a bunch of values, and then I started ranking them. I had to do definitions, and then I would, over time, find research or psychology articles, management articles, et cetera, on these topics and see how they fit together. And something that kind of in the middle of my career I was struggling with was, nothing was black and white. Everything in life had some kind of yin and yang balance where things were in relationship to each other. And one day I had a manager, a very senior executive, say to me, he's like, both can be true. And at that point, it just kind of clicked. I'm like, oh, for my operating values to work, it's about combining the components. And so I started to pair the 12 into these 6 groupings and ultimately use those to guide how I think and operate. So if you think about, for example, grit and discipline, we hear about grit and people say, go have grit and stuff. But to have grit, you need to live with discipline. Jocko Willink says, discipline sets you free. But the grit is the value part of what I'm trying to live, and discipline is putting it into practice. And so I was really looking for pairings of how I could live my values in whole, and this is how the list came about.
I'm curious about what values, because all these things sound great, right? I mean, all these things sound perfectly, reasonable. What are the values that did not make the cut that you had to say, well, I have to exclude some or deprioritize some? They're all important. There's other values I have, but these are the top 12 or sort of top six pairs. What are some ones that were kind of on the borderline and didn't make the final 12?
Hmm. It's a great question. I think at the beginning, to be honest, I struggled with what are values. A lot of times my list didn't include values; they included tactics, um, and so there were a lot of pieces that I didn't include. So you'll notice, for example, empathy is not on here, which is kind of a strange thing because compassion is. And so, for example, empathy was like really difficult for me wrestling with. And I heard Jeff Weiner talk about the difference between empathy and compassion. And I really came to understand, oh, compassion is what I'm after. Compassion is really about being able to care about what's happening with somebody else and be willing to put my time and effort forward to help them help themselves be better or provide support in some way. Whereas empathy is just that feeling of it. So, for example, I took empathy off my list. Um, a lot of times people talk about truth. I just want truth. Just give me the data, right? Two different things, but I'll use both of them. Well, for me, truth really evolved into integrity. So scrap truth. Integrity was about what I say is what I do, is what I mean, and that alignment about who I am and how I've lived my life is consistent. And anybody who's taken like the authentic leadership course will hear about that. But knowing how to live that value means I'll deploy truth and I'll be truthful. A lot of people talked about, I want to be data driven. I would see that. Well, being data driven is good, and I agree, and I'm a pretty data driven person myself, but I had to scrap that and I got into logic, which was really what I'm looking for is sound logic and common sense in decision making processes. Data is an element of that. And so I ended up evolving data driven into logic. And furthermore, when I started to think about it that way, I saw that the behavior practice I needed was to be open minded and have debate and being able to be willing to shed ideas that are wrong in order for me to learn and grow. And so the focus wasn't just on the data, it was on good logic.
Let's talk about some of the operating practices. I'll just read all 7, and then we can kind of go back and go through some of them. So, habits and routines. Number 2 is prioritization. Number 3 is time blocking and deep work. Number 4 is email processing. Number 5 is don't reinvent the wheel. Number 6, get leverage. And number 6, texting versus talking. Talk to me about how you came up with this list.
So for me, it's interesting. These are things that I would say over time in my career, I had to learn how to do. I don't know if you remember kind of joining as a BA, but early days of being a junior consultant, I felt very overwhelmed and I needed to learn to adapt how I worked from school into a new way of working as a consultant. It was faster, obviously more stressful, and I needed to be more productive. And so over the next 10 or 15 years, I started researching and practicing how to be a more productive person. And so a lot of these came from that. So for example, the very first and most important thing I ended up learning is habits and routines. Like, I remember thinking to myself, I'm not the same person I was a year ago. And so if that means I can change as a person, can I take active participation in planning that change? And that's where I started to think about habit formation. And if I can actually strengthen my habit formation muscle by building little routines so that my behaviors change and I can become a better, prioritizer. I can get things done faster. I can be happier. Let me strengthen and develop that. And so that became a really important foundation to being able to, get stuff done.
So
Um,
let's talk about that. So, what are some habits that you've intentionally worked on developing recently, either installing new habits or eliminating bad habits? Talk to me about some of those.
sure. So I'll go back about 5 years and I'll tell you, like, I hated journaling. I had no morning routine. I was inconsistent at the gym, and I didn't meditate. Um, but I was super stressed out. So I sat down and I literally started drawing up micro habits. And I said, okay, if I write down these micro habits, how can I start to take little actions to develop the capability of just doing something every day? And I got an app where I could actually track my habits. So I put them in a list, and every single day I just tracked it, I do it. So the very first one I ever did was brush my teeth every day. And the idea was, can I prove to myself how to build a habit and strengthen my habit muscle? And the first thing I noticed was, guess what? I don't brush my teeth 100% of the time. I was pretty ashamed to tell my wife that. And so I made improvements to that. The next thing was I started doing meditation every day, got headspace, and just every day, 5 minutes, make sure I do it. Um, and this list of habits started to grow in the difficulty that it required for the discipline of building them, but it became easier to do. So I started doing a morning routine, and I read a blog, My Morning Routine. I would pull people's like activities in the morning, and I'd put some together for myself. And I can tell you today, like, I have meditated for a few hundred days in a row right now. I have a morning routine scripted step by step. I wake up, I do 10 push ups. Then I sit down and I do my meditation in my Headspace app. Then I sit down and I read the Daily Stoic. Then I open up my morning journal and I go through a series of activities. I write down 3 things that I'm grateful for, 3 things I'm excited about. I have a daily affirmation that pops up on my phone. I use it, I ponder it for a second. I list out my top 5 priorities, and then I literally visualize out with boxes how I spend each hour of my day. And then at the end of the day, I now this year a new practice I'm doing is I now do a shutdown routine. So Cal Newport, big on deep work and productivity, talks about having a shutdown routine, and I'll actually go back to my journal. I take a red pen, I redraw how I spent my time based off of how I visualized. I do a like big win and big improvement that I need to make for the next day. I check off what things I got done. And then I write the time just in the corner. I'm like, this is the time I wrapped up. And I close my laptop. I added that last routine just in 2021 because I noticed working from home, I was like spilling over until my wife would come to me and be like, it's time for dinner, close your laptop. And so I needed to develop a new habit or routine to improve my ability to control how I was spending my time and not being overwhelmed, and make sure I was spending time with my wife when I'm working from home during COVID. But I wouldn't have been able to do such a routine if I hadn't started with very small things, and I still track them in a habit app. And I ended up developing the muscle of building a habit.
That sounds like a like sort of a textbook morning routine that you've got there. That is incredible. Keeping that up, and you mentioned some other stuff. Like, what about you mentioned the push-ups in the morning? Do you also have a kind of a workout routine? Any kind of diet routines? Any other habits? I'd be curious to hear that you've developed.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to link the two concepts, my belief is if we can change who we are, we should create a vision for who we want to be, and then go back and think about what habits and routines we can build in order to be able to put some of these behavioral change improvements on autopilot to get to who we want to be. That's the ultimate goal. And because I've studied psychology a little bit, I realized you can't just always will it. So you got to bake these things into habits. The gym is a big one. So what I ended up doing is I ended up blocking off a period of time right in the morning, 8 a.m. to 9, that I do my routine, and then 9 to 10, I go straight to the gym. And for me, it used to be rock climbing. I would rock climb 4 days a week. I had a very specific time I would show up at the gym right in the morning, get everything done, and then go to get to work. In COVID times, I've been able to just do a walk in the park or go for a run. And recently, with the gyms opening up, I've changed my routine and I go directly to the gym 3 days a week and I do rowing. And I have 30 minutes. I have 1 hour in the gym. That's it. I get in, I immediately do my stretches. I do 30 minutes of rowing. I want to hit a certain number of meters. And then I immediately go do crunches and I'm out. And I actually time myself to make sure I'm in and out of the gym in an hour. And I have those very specific markers of what I'm doing in the activities in order to make sure I do it. By making it a habit, it becomes a lot easier. When I'm rowing, because sometimes it gets very rote, I started doing audiobooks. And so like it's my way of engaging and getting an activity and getting to read a book. So like right now I'm listening to Bill Gates's book on how to solve for climate change. And it acts as an incentive for me to get to the gym every day. And that's been really, really helpful. As far as routines to break, I would say one of the most important things that I've had to work on is changing my eating habits. My wife jokes with me about how like when she met me, my idea of a healthy dinner was a steak that was half of the size of the plate, mashed potatoes, and corn on the cob was my veggies, which is starch. So a couple of years ago, I met a guy who said he did intermittent fasting, and I was like, that's nuts. And as soon as I hear myself say that's nuts, my Tim Ferriss, you know, brain goes off in the back, and it's like, okay, so go try to do it. And I did. And I was in my mid 30s. I was feeling like my metabolism was slowing down, and I was really sluggish. And so I just said, okay, I'm not going to eat between midnight and noon every day. By the time I get to noon, I'll eat. And this was also part of like, I don't know about you, but I'll get to the middle of the day and it'll be like 2 or 3 o'clock and I'll be like, oh my God, I forgot to eat because I was so heads down in work or I was running from meeting to meeting. And so trying to solve for those two things, I put in this intermittent fasting. The only thing I'll have between midnight and noon is water and black coffee. And that ended up sticking. It's helped my energy level. It's helped me lose weight. It's obviously helped ensure that I eat in the middle of the day when I need it. So I block off time for that because it's important to me. And I've been doing that for, I'd say, at least 3 years now.
And did you find that changed what you ate as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, you know, just stopping the eating in that time period doesn't solve the problem. But as soon as I am ready to eat, it's usually a salad with a protein, or it's some kind of nourishment that I'm like, you know, really excited to have. So I started caring about my lunch a lot more. I used to be the kind of guy who'd like go into the lunchroom and get leftovers from whatever, you know, catered event was going on, or just go downstairs and like get tacos or something. But because I knew like at noon I am going to be hungry, I have 30 minutes blocked, I'm going to eat, I started bringing lunches or pre-planning. And so I put more thought into it. It's kind of like, let's say, a secondary effect.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about some of these other operating practices. So maybe let's jump to time blocking and deep work,
Mm-hmm.
which you've already touched on a little bit, but elaborate a bit on the time blocking and on the deep work practices that you've put in place.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my hat's off to Cal Newport for really helping me think through this in a better way. But I'll say it started when I was working at Bridgewater Associates, which for people who don't know, it's the world's biggest hedge fund founded by Ray Dalio, who's got a set of principles that are quite unique for operating a culture. And I was chief of staff to the head of the portfolio management department that oversaw the execution of Bridgewater's investments. And I was in the beginning underperforming, and my solution was just to work more. Like I would not go home, I would work till 3 a.m., etc. And most of it was because as chief of staff, I'm in a meeting from like 8 a.m. to almost 8 p.m., like nonstop. And then I also have to do my own work to like follow up on all the threads. And then I'm running special projects on the side. And I just simply did not have enough time. And I was getting burnt out. And my executive just said to me, he was like, you need to learn to work smarter, not harder. You can run through any wall, but sometimes you need to know when to go over or around the wall. And I was like, oh my God. I'm sitting there at 3 a.m. in the dark, computer screen in my face. And I'm like, how do I do this different? And so I luckily stumbled upon the deep work and some other um, classics of manager versus maker. And I started shifting my time. I just said, okay, I'm going to start doing some time blocks. And that way I knew exactly what I had to get done in a specific time. Previously, what I had done is I let my calendar control me. People would throw time on my calendar. So I started saying no, because I have this time block to get that work done. And I wouldn't just like put a block on that would say block, which is something I feel like a lot of people do and I used to do. I started to be very specific. I have an hour to write this deck. I have a half hour to process emails, and so on. And by forcing myself to visualize how I spent my time through time blocking, I was getting better at making sure I was getting stuff done. And then I noticed, well, there was maker versus manager. And I was looking at myself going, okay, most of my work's manager, but I do have all this maker work. Like I have to sit down and build decks. I have to sit down and build plans. I have to sit down and review content. So I started creating bigger chunks of time. And what I noticed is if I do it in the morning, I can crush through like really deep work. And something that used to be a deck that I would kind of dabble in all week when I had 30 minutes would get done in just like one sitting. And my cycle time for producing work sped up. Because normally what I would do is say, okay, that thing's due Friday. I'm going to start on Monday. I'm going to dabble in it all week. And by the time I get to Friday, I have like a draft version I'm reviewing. Instead, I would just put something on for Tuesday, sit down for an hour, and I would be like, how do I move the ball 50% forward? I'd crush through that, and then I'd let it sit, or I'd share it with someone, get feedback on it, and the cycle of getting to what the end product would be faster, and the work quality would be better. And so I started to utilize these tactics of visualizing out my time blocks and making sure I distinguished when I needed blocks to get deep work done, rather than thinking I can jump from meeting to meeting and have half an hour in between to like spin up a deck on something.
Amazing. What this is? That sounds like again textbook deep work. Nir Eyal talks about it in his book Indistractable. Talking to me about email processing. That's another one of your operating practices.
Yeah. So you'll probably notice a theme here, and I think it's really important. I don't think the things that I do are special. I think the things I do are known things that are proven to work, but people don't often go out, learn, and put the time, effort, and discipline into executing. I really think learning from others is a valuable ability to do. And so, um, I picked this up from Cal, but there's the classic like email processing system from for getting things done. And same thing. I felt like, you know how social media stuff is popping up on your phone all the time and it can like inundate you and it's overwhelming and it constantly feels like everything is almost in chaos mode and it never stops? You ever felt like that?
Well, I've certainly felt like chaos mode. I pretty much turn off all notifications and I don't do Facebook or Twitter anymore. But I know what you mean.
Exactly. So you're a step ahead of the game. Um, that was pretty much how I felt about email, is it would never stop. It was just a flood of noise. And so I couldn't develop good routines and focus on my priorities or effectively time block in order to produce deep work if I'm constantly being inundated with email. And so I set up basically a time block in the morning to process email. So what I do is, I talked to you about like, I get up in the morning, I do my morning routine. If I'm going to the gym that day, I go to the gym. I do not look at email until after the gym. I do not wake up in the morning and go through my emails. I put a half-hour block on, and the first thing I do when I sit down and get to work is I crush through my email. I'll usually check something in the middle of the day, like at lunchtime, and see if there's any high priority things. And then towards the end of the day, I actually do a wrap up, or I'll do processing on things that I need to get set and moving for the next day. And so two things are important out of this. First thing is I'm able to not be inundated, focus on, when I'm in a meeting doing a one-on-one, I'm paying attention to my employee. If I'm in a meeting solving a problem, I'm giving people my attention and learning and listening and collaborating with them. So I become better as a manager, as a leader, and as just a person. The second thing is, you'd be surprised how many things solve themselves when you just let an email sit. And that takes the stress off myself. It empowers others to solve problems, and more gets done. It's kind of a small tactic for getting leverage.
That's another one of your operating practices. In what ways have you gone out to get leverage?
I think when I was early in my career, my only solution for solving problems was to look internally to myself and see what I could do that solve things. And that was a mindset. And the first thing that changed was changing my mindset to get leverage, which is, wait a second, do I have to do this thing? Or am I just responsible for this thing getting done? And then the second thing became, do I have to build this? Or can we buy this? If I can buy it, well, it also means I can outsource it. So that's another form of getting leverage. Then I started managing things. And as I started to manage parts of organizations, I started to think about, okay, do I have to just give this to a person or a team, or could I decompose parts of this process or machine across different parties in a way that gives leverage to actually getting the job done? And so one of the first things I always try to think about is, do I have to solve this myself? Is there somebody else who can solve it? Or am I responsible for it just being solved? Can I buy or build it? And if there isn't one single person to do it, can I decompose this and spread it out across others to get it done? Because ultimately, at the goal level, the objective is the thing is accomplished.
And then I'd love to hear about texting versus talking.
So just to date myself, I mean, like I had a pager in school, and then I got a cell phone. I had the old Nokia. So I am exactly on the cusp of two generations. And I do text, but one of the things I noticed, texting's okay for quick information. What it doesn't do is communicate to another party much of what we get when we talk to somebody. So 70% of your communication is verbal and gestures. So all I'm getting is like quick snippets. And a lot of that would mean that the effectiveness of engaging with somebody, building a relationship, learning, the speed at which you can ask questions and exchange ideas, that kind of conversational engagement is suboptimal in texting. Whereas talking, I can quickly ask you a question and I can go, oh, I'm off on something here. Like, what am I missing? Or I can quickly engage with a question. And so ultimately at work, I started to notice I get better results for conversations by talking, not having text conversations. Texting is really good for quick snippets of informations. It doesn't convey emotions well. So I really wanted to make sure I knew when to use talking and when to use texting in order to solve for different things.
Let's talk a little bit about some of your consulting work and some of your executive work. So after Bridgewater, I think that you helped Knotel grow. Tell us a little bit about that experience at Knotel, and maybe just for
Sure.
listeners who aren't familiar with it, give listeners a quick overview of what Knotel is, and that's Knotel, like knowledge hotel, right?
Right. So actually, after I left Bridgewater, I ended up doing freelance consulting. And I was working with a variety of different startups, ad tech and some others. And I actually started at Knotel, which provide flexible office space, full floor solutions for companies. It does, it manages the lease, does the build out, does the fit out, and it has a subscription model um, for rent essentially. And it also does your IT. So at the time, it was like a 25-person startup just got its Series A, and it was like a hacky version of, we had a full floor with two companies that shared it, instead of WeWork where it was like a small couple people in a box. And the idea was you graduate from co-working into your own office, but you don't have to take on all the responsibilities and the long-term lease risk. Um, and my very first thing was run the sales team. Okay, what's wrong with your sales team? I don't know. They're not hitting numbers. So I started going in and looking at some of the basic components. And what I saw was people just didn't have like the frameworks for understanding what a sales lifecycle was. The tools weren't set up. Nobody had the metrics. And so if you just kind of sat down and put the process in place and kind of walk people through it and hold them accountable to working on it, we made improvements. And obviously, when you're building a startup, there isn't a lot of structure. So being able to add structure to things, but not too much, can be really helpful. So I ended up joining full time as director of strategy and building and running a variety of things. So I started building and standing up customer success and revenue operations. And then it's like implementing CRM, and then it's implementing construction project management tool. And then it's like, well, wait a second, does our entire process work? I don't know, but we need that thing to work because that's core to how much we invest in actually acquiring space. That's core to our unit economics, which is what we're fundraising on. And the faster we can do that, the better. So like, how do we figure out how to improve those things? And I got to bring a lot of my consulting skills to the people, processes, and technology of how we actually executed our business and be able to build at the same time that we were blitz scaling. And over the 3 years, we raised over $500 million. We scaled from being just in New York to 12 cities around the world. When I started, we had about 250,000 square feet. At the end of 2019, early 2020, we were about 4 million square feet and had closed our Series C at a $1.5 billion valuation and 500-person headcount. So in 3 years, to grow from 25 to 500 and 250,000 to 4 million square feet around the world, you've got to build a lot, and you got to build a lot fast.
What were some of your key learnings from that experience?
Well, there are a couple of different levels we could talk about that. The first I would say is the importance of culture. Obviously how a business is led and its ability to solve problems and move very quickly is critical. And the pace at which you're bringing people in, 20 people a week almost, it starts to dilute your culture, and you got to figure out how to keep that culture healthy. So I learned a lot about that and the failures of what a lot of organizations don't do. And as a result, their culture gets diluted, or it becomes a lot of internal politics and fragmentation and stifles not only problem solving and innovation, but also just your ability to execute well. The second thing is I learned a ton about you can let a lot of fires burn. As a consultant, everything I felt like had to be perfect. But when you're moving at that speed, you can make this trade-off between speed and efficiency. And you can actually let the quality of some things slip lower than what I was used to as a consultant for Fortune 500 companies, and it's just fine. Another thing I learned is do process automate. You have a problem. My very first step was okay, person, you own that problem. Go work on that problem. Figure out how to make that thing work. Here's what good looks like. And then once they start to put that together, I'd come back and say, oh, you built some spreadsheets and you have a few steps. Okay, let's document them, and let's see if we can, with the idea of leverage, let's see if we can spread that across a couple of different teams so that it doesn't have to be a full-time job for one person, and we can reallocate resources. Now that we got a process, and that process is replicable, and we can start to scale that across multiple people, let's start to automate that thing so that we can get it off everybody's plate. That was an incredibly important tactic for being able to build at speed. Um, and ultimately, I also found that like when you're in a startup and you start very early, um, the pie is growing so big and things are moving so fast, it is natural and it is okay for people to get topped. And this is something I think a lot of people don't talk about in startup land, but um, I'll see people who like have never been a manager, first few years of their career, all of a sudden they're managing a team and they want to be like VP or head of X, and somebody gets hired in above them and they get like upset. Um, and ultimately, what you did in that early stage is super valuable, but it doesn't mean you're necessarily the right person to run the next version of the thing. And one of the things I think about being able to grow as a person is have the knowledge and humility of like, where are you in that phase and what are you going to learn from somebody else more experienced coming in, and you working to help make that person successful makes the organization successful, more opportunity you have to go do other things in the organization. So I built the first version of the customer success team, but then I ended up also working to like hire somebody to run that entire team and build it and grow it. What I did though was I put the foundations in, I hired a few people, I set up a plan for where I think we needed to go. And then when we brought that person in, I helped onboard that person. And then I went on to build 2, 3 other teams. And I really enjoyed that. And I ended up running multiple teams. But I didn't feel bad about the fact that I didn't stay the leader of that team. And I think that's a really important lesson for people to have in startups.
Tell us a bit about your practice now. I understand that you do some work as interim executive, you do some consulting. Talk to me about what you're engaged in these days.
Yeah. So I really love helping people. Like at the end of the day, my purpose in life is to improve how things work so that it makes other people's lives better. That's the simple goal. And so I noticed that I had these experiences in building and scaling organizations and or transforming organizations. And so oftentimes I'll be joining an organization as an interim executive and like a COO, and coming in and putting in performance review processes, career matrices, organizing the executive team around OKRs, setting up regular budgets and planning cycles, and ultimately helping to build out their hiring processes to focus on how they actually operate. Sometimes they don't have culture documented and nobody's really thought through how they actually behave in order to onboard people successfully. So I might put these kinds of structures in place in order to really help either the founders or leaders of organizations evolve from what I would say is typically like a nascent adolescent stage into a more mature stage. And one of the reasons I think it's good to do this in an interim capacity is my stake in the game is to make other people successful. It's to improve the team's lives because how the business operates is better. So I'll oftentimes take COO roles in that capacity. Another thing I often do will come in and I'll actually just work with an organization on a particular function and partner with an executive by doing a diagnosis of operations, doing a diagnosis of the people. Sometimes I'll even step in and help lead like a large transformation effort. Maybe they're revamping their CRM, ERP, procurement function and need to help with guiding vendor selection and teaching people how to write requirements and making sure that they have good gating mechanisms, but the organization needs to learn. And I have a particular ability to go from the like conceptual to the practical. And so that helps people be able to do that and alleviate time stresses from the executive leading it. And so oftentimes I'll do that. Sometimes it's just as simple as like coming in and doing some executive coaching or doing a talk to an organization and doing some training with them on here's some mental maps for how you can operate better together. So for example, maybe we want to talk about how to give people instructions as a manager, by telling them, this is my opinion as a person, this is my strong suggestion as a leader, or this is a mandate as the boss, can be a small tactical thing that changes how people's relationships with their managers are getting done. I also do some work on teaching people how to have great one-on-ones. I have 5 very simple questions that I do, and by coming in and teaching people how to run a one-on-one, they get better at actually managing the organization and producing better results. So these kinds of things.
Oh, I got to ask, what are the 5 simple questions?
So every week I have people say, number 1, how are you feeling? 1 to 5. 1 being terrible, 3 being neutral, 5 being awesome. Usually the first thing people are like, well, at work or life or whatever. The whole point is just like, how are you? Because you are a whole person. And that usually leads to me like digging in a little bit. Number 2, what did you accomplish last week? You'll notice this is not tell me the tasks. This is what is the goal and what is the outcome you produced. Number 3, what are your goals or objectives for this week? So where were we? Where are we going? And this usually creates an opportunity for them to say, well, I'm thinking through it like this, or I need some help from you. And so my 4th question is always, what do you need from me? Ultimately, as a manager, as an executive, my goal, my objective, and my responsibility is to help others be successful. And the 5th thing is there anything else to discuss? Because I always want to create an opportunity at the end to ask people what's on their minds. It might be something that's going on in their personal lives. It might be, hey, I want to plan a vacation. It might be, I heard such and such politics. What's really going on? And if you don't actually take the active step of creating the safe space, how are you ever going to build psychological safety to be capable of leading that person to being great and actually growing as a person? And so that's the last question.
Wow, that sounds like a good set of questions for a one-on-one. So I'm going to include a link in the show notes for your website, bradenww.com. That's BRADENWW.com, where listeners, you can go and go to the About page. You can check out Braden's operating system, the full detailed description of it. Braden, any other place that you'd want to point listeners who want to find out more about your work?
I think the website's great. Obviously, I'm on LinkedIn, but people can read and get a hold of me through the website. And so I look forward to hearing from people.
Fantastic. Well, Braden, thanks so much for joining today. Really enjoyed the discussion. I'm inspired and motivated now to work on my own operating system and to get some of my own habits and routines enhanced. So thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you for having me.